What actually became of the man who moved from the streets to the pulpit, Pastor Zachery Timms, from celebrity to a strange death in a hotel room in New York, from addiction to salvation? How did one of the most captivating preachers in America get embroiled in one of the decade's most startling church scandals? This is not another tale of a pastor who has fallen from grace. It serves as a terrifying reminder of how even the most potent ministries can be internally destroyed by notoriety, temptation, and secret suffering. The reality regarding Pastor Zachery Timms' last days is far more complex and tragic than anyone could have ever guessed, so stay with me. Pastor Zachery Timms was regarded as a man chosen by God until his untimely death rocked the globe. A strong preacher who overcame drug addiction to become the leader of one of America's fastest-growing megachurches. His tale was meant to be one of divine purpose and redemption. However, few people really understood the secrets that lay beneath the fame, the TV appearances, and the happy sermons. This video reveals the ascent, decline, and enigmatic demise of Pastor Zachery Timms, the man who amassed a spiritual empire before losing it all in ways that still cause people to wonder. Beyond the news, we'll delve into his personal struggles, the unseen demands of celebrity, and the circumstances that led him to that terrible night in New York City. You'll learn about the disputes that split his church, the rumors about his personal problems that some of his closest associates attempted to conceal, and the unsolved mysteries surrounding his unexpected passing that left his followers in shock. This is where things become fascinating, though. Most people have never heard of some of the specifics that are hidden beneath years of quiet. You'll know more about what actually transpired and why Pastor Timms' tale continues to reverberate across the Christian world over 10 years later after seeing this film. Therefore, pay close attention, because what we're about to reveal could alter your perception of both Pastor Zachery Timms and the more sinister aspects of contemporary ministry in general. Long before he discovered his purpose, a young guy from Baltimore was cast off by many. This was before the national limelight, the megachurch, and the renown. On April 18, 1969, Zachery Timms was born into a world full of violence, adversity, and dashed hopes. His early years were characterized by hardship, a home with only one parent, little money, and the lure of the streets. Timms had become severely addicted to drugs by the time he was a teenager. He turned to crack cocaine as an escape from the suffering and unpredictability of his environment. He was neither a visionary, a role model, nor a preacher. He was but another statistic in the making. However, an unforeseen circumstance occurred that altered everything. Zachery Timms, who was only 19 years old, claims to have had a heavenly experience while incarcerated after being caught and facing the very real prospect of serving time in prison. According to his own account, he heard God's voice telling him that his life had a higher purpose. He made a vow there in that prison cell. He would serve in ministry for the rest of his life if God offered him another chance. He honored his word after being freed. Timms, who was determined to start over, went to college and eventually graduated from the University of Maryland with a degree in psychology. His metamorphosis started to motivate everyone around him throughout this period. He wasn't merely advocating for change. He was a living example of how things could change. Timms and his then-wife Reva Timms relocated to Florida in the middle of the 1990s in order to establish the New Destiny Christian Center in Apopka, which is located just outside of Orlando. With humility, the church started. A small group of people huddled together, praying, believing, and hoping for progress. However, Zachery captivated everyone with his charm, vigor, and life narrative. The throngs increased week after week. His sincerity and teachings were not the only things that moved people. He was candid about his history, his addiction, his errors, and his recovery. He was relatable because of his openness, particularly to those who felt lost, broken, or undeserving of mercy. The New Destiny Christian Center has grown rapidly by the early 2000s. Every week, thousands of people came to his services. He immediately rose to prominence in the televangelism industry, as his sermons were aired nationally on the Trinity Broadcasting Network. He traveled abroad, wrote books, and made connections with prominent officials and preachers around the nation. Pastor Zachery Timms appeared to the outside world to be living the life of success, a man who became a spiritual powerhouse after overcoming adversity. His life served as a living example of hope and proof that anyone may be saved by God. However, there were fissures developing behind the cheers, the dazzling lights, and the motivational speeches. Fissures that will soon expand into something nobody anticipated, because Zachery Timms was silently fighting his own demons once more as he was assisting countless in finding salvation. Pastor Zachery Timms' prominence and the associated strain increased along with the size of his ministry. A small local church of a few dozen soon grew into a worldwide ministry that now serves tens of thousands of people. He was no longer merely a preacher, he was a public figure, a brand, and a famous pastor. He took the stage at New Destiny Christian Center every Sunday, bearing the burden of hundreds of people who looked to him for inspiration, hope, and answers. He delivered exciting sermons. His speech was strong, intimate, and unvarnished. He was viewed as an untouchable man who was fervently devoted to God. However, Zachery was burning out behind the scenes, something that most people were unaware of. It became evident from interviews and subsequent testimonies from those who knew him well that Pastor Tim found it difficult to uphold the reputation that everyone held him to. He was always on the road, giving talks at conferences, organizing outreach initiatives, handling money, and juggling a ministry that never slept with a family life. And even in the guise of faith, celebrity can lead to temptation. He received more attention, both positive and negative, the more well-known his platform got. His fans loved him. His wealth and leadership were questioned by some, and Zachery started to lose the calm, modest equilibrium that had previously characterized him. Somewhere between his calling and the never-ending pressures of achievement, he frequently discussed spiritual warfare, or the invisible conflicts that Christians deal with on a daily basis. However, that conflict wasn't symbolic for him. It was intense, real, and very intimate. Within his circle, there were rumors that the same monsters he had vanquished were starting to reappear. Friends observed behavioral changes, mood swings, fatigue, and a restlessness that seemed to worsen with time behind closed doors. There were reports that distance, stress, and emotional detachment were the main causes of the severe strain in his marriage to Riva. After years of serving together in ministry, the couple's divorce in 2009 made those speculations a reality. A bitter and public separation rocked the Christian community. The revelation was shocking to many of his supporters. How was it possible for a guy who preached about family and faith to lose what he treasured most? His leadership was questioned by several. Others stood up for him, arguing that even pastors are fallible human beings. Few people understood, however, that this was just the start of his downhill trajectory. Pastor Tim seemed intent on moving on after the divorce. He kept preaching, grinning, and talking about recovery and forgiveness. However, those closest to him eventually disclosed that he had changed on the inside. Quiet suffering had replaced the same fervor that had once driven his ministry. Zachery's world split in two as the years passed. On Sunday mornings, the world witnessed the charismatic and well-groomed preacher. Behind the scenes, he struggled with loneliness, stress, and spiritual exhaustion. Appearances were crucial in the high-stakes realm of celebrity preaching. However, the fact remains that human frailties affect even pastors and people who transform thousands of lives. The previously tiny fissures had started to enlarge and will eventually reveal the more sinister truths that lie beneath them. Because although everyone believed Pastor Timms had permanently overcome his past, the temptations he had previously resisted were lurking in the background, waiting for him, tenacious, patient, and prepared to go back. Pastor Zachery Timms appeared to be starting a new phase of his life by the summer of 2011. He appeared to be a guy who had overcome heartache, reaffirmed his faith, and recommitted himself to his purpose. Once more, his church was flourishing. He continued to preach to thousands of people around the nation, and his television appearances were becoming more and more popular. However, there were indications that something was seriously off beneath that exterior. His closest friends and family observed that he had grown more aloof, reserved, and reclusive, and that he frequently traveled alone. He would disappear for several days at a time, claiming that he needed time to rest or spend time alone with God. However, there were hints of something more hidden behind those justifications. A return to the battles that had almost ruined him. Pastor Timms checked into the W Hotel in New York City in the beginning of August 2011. Part of an increasingly covert ministry journey, it was intended to be a short visit. However, the Christian world would be rocked by what followed. Zachery Timms was found unconscious in his room by the W Hotel's housekeeping staff on August 12, 2011. Within hours, the news spread. One of the most charismatic leaders in contemporary ministry, the 42-year-old pastor, had passed away. Initially, there were few details. In a brief statement reporting his death, the church asked for prayers and solitude. However, the conjecture soon started. What had taken place? Why was he at a hotel room in a different city by himself? Furthermore, why was the cause of death kept a secret? When police arrived on the site, they found something that made them wonder even more. A little envelope filled with a white powder. An autopsy was performed by the medical examiner. However, the results were kept secret from the public for weeks. The mystery grew more complex. People were looking for answers. His congregation felt devastated. Pastor Reva Timms, his ex-wife, remained calm despite her grief. God is still in control, she said in public. But there was unfathomable sorrow and bewilderment concealed behind those words. How could someone who had conquered so much and touched so many lives suddenly and tragically fall? Months later, the toxicological results were finally made public, and they supported the fears of many. It appears that Pastor Zachery Timms overdosed and died. Not just his church, but the entire religious community was rocked by the news. It was a betrayal to many of his supporters. They thought he had already vanquished those demons, not because he had sinned. For others, it was devastating evidence that even for those who advocate for redemption, the challenges of addiction never really go away. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this tale was not just how he passed away, but also what his passing disclosed about the tremendous strain that contemporary pastors face. Zachery Timms' narrative revealed a hidden truth in a society that demands perfection from spiritual leaders, that behind the titles, the sermons, and the happy pictures, there are actual people engaged in silent struggles that the general public is never privy to. Observing media outlets flocked to his church after his death in an attempt to piece together his last days. Like wildfire, rumors proliferate, anything from private battles with depression to covert partnerships. Most of it wasn't true, but some of it was. This is what we do know. Pastor Timms was a man divided in his last months between the suffering he was unable to avoid and the vocation he loved. Thousands of people attended his burial. When his corpse was interred in Orlando, there was gospel music, tears, and sincere remembrances from those closest to him at the solemn, emotional farewell. One question, however, persisted in the air as the choir sang and his legacy was celebrated. How was it possible for someone who led so many people to God to lose his personal fight against evil? As many would later remark, understanding rather than judgment is the answer, because failure isn't the only aspect of Zachery Timms' narrative. It concerns the thin line that separates human imperfection from faith. As soon as the death of Pastor Zachery Timms was announced, astonishment gave way to incredulity, which in turn gave way to perplexity. In the hopes that this was all an accident, his church, the members of New Destiny Christian Center, gathered for candlelight services and prayer vigils. However, it wasn't. It was a harsh reality. The man who had created their spiritual home out of nothing was no longer their leader. In a matter of days, New Destiny Christian Center was a site of both sadness and doubt. Not only did thousands of members lose their pastor, but they also lost their fulcrum, a perilous gap that would soon be brimming with stress, gossip, and debate accompanied that loss. There was an urgent question at the heart of it all. New Destiny would be led by whom? At first, many thought that Zachery's ex-wife, Reva Timms, who was also a co-founder of the church, would logically return to the position of leadership. She had, after all, been there from the start, working with him to establish the ministry. The congregation knew her, loved her, and respected her. The board of directors of the church, however, had different ideas. The church community would be rocked by a decision the board made in late 2011. They named the next senior pastor of Next Destiny Christian Center to be Pastor Paula White, a well-known televangelist and friend of the Timms family. Almost at once, uproar broke out. Many churchgoers were taken aback and wondered why Riva, the woman who had shared the ministry's basis and contributed to its creation, was left out of the process. Some people thought the decision was political, made by influential people who wished to save the church's reputation and financial stability. Others believed Zachery's legacy had been betrayed. The reaction was fierce. Churchgoers objected. Debates on social media erupted. The dispute eventually spread from the pulpit to the courtroom. The leadership transition at New Destiny Christian Center was handled poorly and opaquely, according to Riva Timms, who sued the organization and its board. She maintained that outsiders with their own goals were changing the legacy of her late ex-husband. There were now divisions within the once cohesive spiritual group. Some support Paula White, while others are faithful to Riva. Zachery Timms' church, which he had established with love, faith, and redemption, was now a battlefield of authority, control, and public scrutiny. After being picked up by news sources, the tale became a national spectacle. They were all over the headlines. Following the pastor's passing, the church splits. The contentious ministry is taken over by Paula White. Riva Timms defends her husband's heritage. Leadership was no longer the only factor. Identity was at issue. Who was going to continue the vision that Pastor Timms had initiated? Who would define the true meaning of New Destiny? Riva maintained her composure while being forceful in interviews. Many people who believed that the church had lost its moral compass found resonance in her statement. This isn't about me. It's about what's right. It's about honoring what God began through Zachery. Conversely, Paula White defended her appointment, saying that she had intervened to provide guidance and healing to a deeply hurting church. She emphasized that her goal was to preserve, not replace, Pastor Timms' vision while speaking of reconciliation and healing. However, the congregation's wounds persisted despite their assurances. Members fled, attendance declined, and mistrust and internal strife overtook what had previously been one of Florida's most active ministries. Even if some of the legal disputes were resolved after years, the psychological wounds persisted. The church made it through, but it was never the same. Riva Timms, meantime, carried on with her own ministry on her own, starting Majestic Life Church, where she preached the same doctrine that she and Zachery had previously discussed: grace, faith, and redemption. She frequently discussed healing, forgiveness, and allowing God take care of the suffering that people are unable to. However, Pastor Timms' legacy remained divided throughout time. Some saw him as a fallen man, a warning about the perils of temptation and arrogance. Others saw him as a flawed hero who demonstrated that even God's chosen ones can experience hardship, fail, and still merit grace. Perhaps this is why his narrative is so profoundly relatable. It's more than just a story of a preacher who got lost. It reflects the fact that we are all incredibly frail, regardless of how fervent our faith seems on the outside. However, few people discuss the story's other chapter, because among people who knew Pastor Timms the best, something significant started to happen after the litigation, the leadership changes, and the years of silence. They began to view his legacy differently. Pastor Zachery Timms' narrative is still relevant today, over 10 years after his passing, not only inside places of worship, but also among everybody who has ever had to deal with the agonizing tension between one's own frailty and social expectations. Examining his life in retrospect reveals a man who was both remarkable and typical. Through his story, he had a remarkable ability to uplift, guide, and save others from despair. He was fragile, imperfect, and occasionally broken, but he was also incredibly human. His narrative is so significant and eerie because of that disparity. Because when you take away the spotlight, the TV cameras, and the fame, you're left with a guy who yearned for the things that all believers desire: to serve God, live purposeful life, and find peace. However, in his quest for grandeur, that serenity somehow eluded him. Many people, both inside and outside the church, found it difficult to understand his death. How could someone who was so gifted and anointed end himself in the same dark place from which he had previously fled? In addition to his followers, his friends, family, and even other pastors who identified with him were troubled by this question. His story evolved into more than just a warning. In the years that followed, it turned into a mirror reflecting an unpleasant reality of contemporary religious culture. Pastors are all too frequently exalted to the point where humanity is out of place. They are supposed to be flawless, unflappable, and impervious to suffering and temptation. Nevertheless, grace is at the heart of Christianity, grace that conceals flaws. Grace that is there for us when we are at our lowest. Even when the world criticizes, grace can repair. Zachery Timms saw grace as his battle and his message. Because he knew what it meant to be redeemed, he taught about redemption. However, he found it more difficult to heal himself, as do many people who bear the burden of healing others. Pastor Tim mentioned something that many people now remember with great emotion in one of his last sermons, which he gave shortly before he passed away. Don't let your brokenness prevent you from believing that God can still use you, he urged, adding that you might be called by God and still be shattered. His own existence is now hauntingly prophesied by those statements. God uses a guy powerfully, but he is stuck in the shadows of his history. Perhaps that's the goal, though. Perhaps his story is about the intricacy of grace rather than failure. After his passing, Reva Timms and their 4 kids have had to reconstruct their lives. Reva frequently discusses faith, forgiveness, and the value of accountability in ministry and public speeches. She only ever expresses love and introspection, never resentment. She has stated unequivocally that Zachery's legacy should be honored for the innumerable lives he had affected during his lifetime, not for the way he passed away. She is correct. Due to the fact that during his ministry, thousands of people were saved, families were restored, addicts were set free, and young people were encouraged to think they were deserving of love. His influence cannot be quantified by a single tragic conclusion. Today, the New Destiny Christian Center remains intact. It has undergone seasons of change, new leadership, and adjustments, yet it continues to serve as a living example of how a man's vision can transcend his shortcomings. People still congregate in that sanctuary every Sunday, singing the same hymns and carrying remnants of Pastor Tim's sermon that no matter how far you've fallen, you can still get back on your feet. Many people take away from his life the message that spiritual leaders require room to be human. Yes, they require accountability, but they also require empathy, because we encourage pastors to conceal, to fake, and to remain silent when we foster a culture that prevents them from being open about their difficulties. The story of Zachery Timms compels us to examine that unsettling reality. It serves as a reminder that even the most powerful ministry can fail in the face of concealment, and even greatest faith can waver under duress. It also serves as a reminder that there is never any waste in redemption. His journey from the pulpit to the suffering and from the streets to salvation is evidence that God can pour out His will even through broken vessels.